Okay, thank you, Alex, for that update. It's a fast-moving story. Let's go to Ryan Mauro. He's an investigative researcher of extremist groups and foreign threats at the Capital Research Center, and he joins us now. Ryan, I'd love to start with the question which you're probably the most qualified to discuss with us this morning, and that is understanding who might just be taking over Syria. If it is true now that the regime in Syria is turning over, the Assad regime, after 24 years, is losing power, what do we know about the extremist groups who've been waging this campaign now for, 12 years, and look like they could be taking power in Syria?
Right, well, the one that's getting the most attention because they're leading the fight in Damascus and taking over places is called HTS. It's a Turkey-backed jihadist group that used to be part of Al-Qaeda. And the only reason that they're not part of Al-Qaeda is because Al-Qaeda was not so popular with those that it wanted to ally with. So you're talking about essentially Al-Qaeda backed by Turkey taking over a large part of Syria anyway. Some people are characterizing it as a complete takeover, but that's actually not true. There are other rebel groups, including ones that have long worked with the United States. There's some that have even worked with Israel. So there are alternatives here. So when we talk about the rebels, it's not like a single thing.
You know, one of the things I've been thinking about is what is best for the people in Syria. How do we know that this group or some combination of the other rebel groups is going to, in the long run, be better? And also, I'm concerned about the Christian minority. These are ancient Christian groups. Some people say they were better or at least somewhat protected under Assad and that now they'll be exposed. But then I've seen contradictory things. Where does that stand?
Well, in regards to the Christians, which is about 10% of the population,
right,
there is a divide. And there are some that favor Assad's rule, not because they love what he's doing to his people. I mean, it's just horrific. The numbers, the torture, it's just unbelievable. He's like a supervillain on the worst scale. But because they fear that the jihadist rebels are going to try to exterminate them.
Yeah.
Now, HTS, the Al-Qaeda type group, is trying to have better PR and be more strategic and diplomatic than Al-Qaeda, and is saying we're going to protect the Christians. We'll see about that. But really, the only alternative to in this particular scenario that we have, because the Assad regime is basically gone, is to support groups like the Syrian Democratic Forces, which includes a Christian component. Allied with Sunni Arabs and allied with Kurds, and has long worked with the United States and controls most of the oil and gas. So to me, it seems like that's the most, backing them seems to be the most obvious option. I don't think that we can take a position of not getting involved because we're already involved. We already have military forces operating in Syria.
Yeah, and obviously, we're not the only ones involved there. There are all kinds of proxies that are involved there. When you look at this sort of big picture overnight, can you identify any outside country or group that benefits the most from what's happened over the last couple of weeks and then especially last night?
Sure. I mean, every adversary of the Iranian regime and what they call the axis of resistance, the legion of terrorist groups that Iran sponsors, are all hurt by this because they're so dependent on receiving Iranian aid through Syria and aid from the Syrian government directly. So this is a hellish scenario for the Iran-backed terrorist groups and the Iranian regime itself. Therefore, it does benefit Turkey, which I think is ultimately to our detriment, but it also benefits the U.S. and especially Israel, because even though a large chunk of the rebels are jihadists, Israel basically had a choice. They could either have Iran on its border, representing a strategic threat because Iran controlled the Assad regime, or they can have a more Somalia-type situation where you have all these fighting groups and they're busy fighting each other. So that's not a strategic threat. It's not the same thing as having an enemy nation against you.
Ryan, I'm curious about what happens next. Obviously, as what you laid out, Iran loses. They're the biggest loser in this entire equation. Syria is, I believe I'm correct here, population-wise primarily Sunni, and these rebel groups are Sunni Muslims. That pushes Iran and its Shia Muslim power grip over Syria out. But what you talked about the United States playing a role. How do we, I guess we will play a role, but how concerned are we that Syria falls down the path of so many other countries who lost a stabilizing force, maybe a malevolent force, but still a malevolent stabilizing force, into what we saw in Iraq, you know, chaos, civil war, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, jihadists, terrorism. Like, how concerned should we be that this is the future now for Syria and the potential to blow back on the United States?
No, I mean, the consequences, negative consequences are very, very real for us to consider because jihadists are recruited and get battle practice in scenarios like this, in civil wars. Then when the civil war is over, jihadists don't just stop the jihad, they look elsewhere. For the foreseeable future, a lot of that fighting is going to be within Syria, I think. I personally do not consider Assad to have been a stabilizing force because he did cultivate these al-Qaeda type elements, even as he fought them at times by promoting their ideology. A lot of American soldiers lost their lives in Iraq because Assad was helping the al-Qaeda elements go into Iraq and try to destroy the place. That's kind of the scenarios where you have these competing radicals, and really what the U.S. interest is going to be similar to what it has been, where we've had special forces in there working with Kurds, the rebel force I mentioned before, in protecting what it can of the oil and the gas and trying to keep down ISIS and stop them from reforming, which is a possibility. And I think that could expand to trying to counter HTS and the other jihadist rebels, because you don't want them to get control of the entirety of Syria and those resources either.
What kind of risk is there that this destabilization that Will was talking about could expand beyond Syria? Are you concerned about that?
I am. I think that there's a strong possibility it could expand into Lebanon because Hezbollah is there. And I think that the jihadists who have fought this long civil war, and the non-jihadists as well, against Assad are not going to be too happy with the idea that a lot of these Hezbollah war criminals have gone over to Lebanon. So I could see it spilling over to there. HTS, I mean, the official name of the organization means the Organization for the Liberation of the Levant, which refers to countries outside of Syria, it refers to the whole neighborhood. So ideologically, even though they try to make it sound like they're just pure Syrian nationalists and that's all they care about, it's just a strategic move. It's just PR. They, just like the other jihadists, seek a caliphate, and so does the Turkish dictator. And we have to keep that in mind as Turkey's lobby operates in the United States to try to convince all of us that they and the jihadists they support are some type of moderate solution to the problem.
So, Ryan, over the next week, what are you going to be looking at, like, big picture-wise, about? I mean, you know, obviously Israel shares a good border with Syria. Are we going to see tanks rolling into Syria from other countries? Are we going to? What are you looking for over the next week in terms of countries trying, you know, outside forces trying to help stabilize things?
Well, there already are Israeli operations going on along that border area right now in order to protect Israel. And like I said, it's public information now that Israel's worked with around a dozen rebel groups in order to help protect itself in that part of the area. So I don't foresee anyone besides maybe the Turks really getting involved there militarily. There's already some fighting between some of the rebel groups, and Turkey and its proxies are going to probably want to move very quickly to attack the Syrian democratic forces that are allied with the United States. Again, particularly because they hate the Kurds, and the Kurds are part of that. But there are also Sunni Arabs and Christians who are part of this. So we have to keep that in mind as well, is that Turkey is an adversary to Christians in Syria as well.
All right,
Point.
Ryan Mauro.
Really good point.
Thank you for being with us this morning, Ryan. Insightful stuff.
Thank you.